It had been a long day, 12 hours of back-to-back meetings, a city council briefing, and a closed-door disciplinary review. My badge might have said chief, but most days I felt like a mediator, budget analyst, and complaint department rolled into one. Still, I loved my job. I loved serving my community. And after decades on the force, I'd finally earned my place, both in uniform and in my quiet little neighborhood by the lake. That evening, I wasn't in uniform. I was wearing a faded blue flannel and jeans, driving my unmarked Tahoe through the winding streets of Willow Creek Estates. The sun had just dipped below the tree line, casting a dusky amber glow over the manicured lawns and stone mailboxes. It was peaceful here, too peaceful for what happened next. I just turned onto Birch Lane Drive when the flicker of red and blue lights lit up my rearview mirror. For a moment, I slowed out of habit. Old training dies hard. But then confusion hit me. This was my neighborhood, and those lights were coming from an old Ford Crown Victoria, the kind the city had phased out nearly a decade ago. The vehicle didn't have any official markings, no decals, no police insignia, just a small, poorly mounted light bar on the dash, and a spotlight duct taped to the driver's side window. I narrowed my eyes. Something was off. Still, I pulled to the curb, more out of curiosity than obligation. The Crown Vic stopped behind me. The engine wheezed as it idled. Through my rearview mirror, I saw the driver's side door open, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out. He was wearing dark cargo pants, combat boots, and a black polo with a small embroidered patch over the heart that read, Community Safety Division, HOA Enforcement. My pulse didn't spike. My training kept me calm. But a new question burned. Who the hell did this guy think he was? He approached the driver's side window, hand on his belt like he was ready to draw something. Not a gun, more likely a flashlight or, God help him, a fake taser. I rolled the window halfway down. Evening, he said gruffly. Do you know why I pulled you over? I gave a neutral smile. Why don't you tell me? You were doing 36 and a 25. That's 11 over. Plus, you failed to signal your turn onto Birch Lane. That's 2 violations. HOA Code Citations 3.4.1 and 4.7.3. I blinked. HOA Code Citations. He reached into a pouch on his belt and produced a yellow slip of paper. It looked like a cross between a parking ticket and a bad photocopy. He held it out. I'll need you to sign here to acknowledge the citation. You have 15 days to pay by check or online through the HOA payment portal. I didn't take the slip. Instead, I looked him in the eye. You mind showing me some ID? He raised an eyebrow. I just gave you the citation. No, I said, I mean a badge. Or a license. Anything that proves you have law enforcement authority to conduct a traffic stop. He shifted. I'm with the HOA's Community Safety Division. We have authorization under the charter to enforce residential code. That's not what I asked, I said calmly. You're conducting a traffic stop on a public street. That's a criminal law function, not a residential one. He puffed his chest. Sir, I'm going to need you to stop obstructing and comply. If you don't sign, I can escalate this. My smile faded. What's your name? I asked. He hesitated. Officer Robert. He trailed off. I let the pause hang in the air, like a trap. Last name? Bennett, he finally said. Officer Robert Bennett. Well, Robert Bennett. I thought you just stepped in it. I slowly reached into my glove box, not for my weapon, which stayed holstered under the driver's seat, but for my wallet. I pulled out my leather badge case and flipped it open, holding it up so he could see the gold. City of Riverside Police Chief, James M. Harris. His eyes widened. The silence between us was deafening. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Robert, I said, step back from the vehicle and take your hands off your belt. He obeyed immediately, as if magnetized backward. You are conducting an illegal traffic stop. You are impersonating a law enforcement officer, and you've attempted to issue a false citation under the color of authority. I need you to stay exactly where you are. Any sudden movement will be interpreted as a threat. I grabbed my phone and dialed dispatch. This is Chief Harris. I need a patrol unit at Birch Lane and Meadow Crossing. Possible 148 PC and impersonation. Suspect is detained but not cuffed. I am safe. Send backup. Robert tried to speak. I didn't mean sir. I was just... Save it. I stepped out of the car and moved around to the back, keeping my eyes on him. He was trembling now, beads of sweat forming at his temples. You got any weapons on you, Robert?
No, sir.
No permit to conduct stops. No post-certification. No academy record. And you think a patch on your shirt gives you power? He said nothing. 2 minutes later, I heard sirens in the distance. Riverside PD wasn't large, but response time in our neighborhood was always sharp. A marked cruiser pulled up, and officers Tran and Lopez stepped out. Tran saw me and raised his eyebrows. Chief, take this gentleman into custody, I said. Impersonation. We'll sort out the rest at the station. Robert didn't resist. He slumped as they cuffed him, muttering, "It was just HOA protocol. They told me I could." I watched them drive away, lights fading into the dusk. I stood there for a moment, the quiet returning. But peace didn't, because if the HOA thought they could authorize fake cops to pull people over, this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom, and I was going to find out just how deep it ran. The night Robert Bennett was taken in, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and my department laptop open in front of me. Every now and then, I glanced out the window toward the lake, a place I used to find peace in. That night, it felt like the shadows held secrets I hadn't been paying enough attention to. I kept replaying the incident in my head. The patch, the language, the brazen confidence. Robert hadn't just improvised. He believed what he was doing was legitimate, and that meant one thing someone had told him he could. First thing the next morning, I headed to the station. Tran and Lopez had filed a preliminary report. Robert had been cooperative, but evasive. He claims the HOA hired him through a security firm, Lopez said, setting a thin manila folder on my desk. Said he was given a uniform, the patch, and a printed SOP. Claims he thought he was just enforcing local rules. Did he have a license, I asked. Expired, Lopez replied. He worked as a private security guard in Arizona 6 years ago. Nothing since. No training, no state license, not even a concealed carry permit. And yet, I muttered, flipping through the pages, he's conducting vehicle stops on public streets. Tran looked uneasy. Sir, if the HOA hired him, how far does this go? That was the question burning in my gut. I dismissed them with thanks and picked up the phone. My next call was to the HOA office. Willow Creek Estates had a small gray brick building nestled next to the community pool. Inside were 2 full-time staffers and the HOA president, Margaret Langley, a woman with an ironed blouse and a voice like ice cubes rattling in a glass. She answered after the second ring. Mrs. Langley, this is Chief Harris. A pause. Then, with artificial sweetness, why? Good morning, Chief. What can we do for Riverside's finest today? I need to speak with you in person regarding Robert Bennett. I believe your office hired him. Another pause. Longer this time. I may have to check our files. He might be a contractor through our private enforcement liaison. But of course, we're happy to cooperate. I'll be there in 15 minutes, I said. And I was. The HOA office looked more like a dentist's waiting room than a seat of authority. The front desk was manned by a young woman named Emily, who gave me a polite smile before buzzing me into the back. Margaret was already waiting in her office, thin, silver-haired, with large pearl earrings, and a folder sitting perfectly centered on her desk. Chief, she said, rising but not offering a handshake. This is most unusual. Not as unusual as someone impersonating an officer in your community, I said, sitting without being asked. She blinked. Then, reaching for the folder, she said, our board approved a resolution last month to engage a community safety liaison. Given the rising concerns about overnight parking, speeding, and vandalism near the lake trail, we felt a more direct presence was necessary. Did you run it through legal? We consulted a former HOA compliance consultant. Yes. Did you verify Robert Bennett's background? He came recommended by the firm. Which firm? A tight smile. Secure Path Solutions, LLC. I pulled a notebook from my jacket and scribbled it down. I'll be contacting them. She shifted slightly in her seat. Chief, I assure you, there was no intent to mislead. Our residents demand a certain level of security. Our budget doesn't allow for full-time officers. The board merely approved a presence with lights, badges, and citations. Now her smile faltered. I saw the citation slip. It asks residents to Zelle funds to a personal account. That's not oversight. That's fraud. She opened her mouth, closed it again. I'd like access to the contract between the HOA and Secure Path, I said. Voluntarily. That will require a board vote. Then schedule it. I stood. You may also want to call a meeting with your liability insurer. because this just became a criminal investigation. Back at the station, I ran a background check on Secure Path Solutions. The company's registration traced back to a P.O. box 2 towns over. Its listed owner, Robert Bennett. He'd registered the LLC just 3 months prior. No business license, no insurance, no record of any employees. It was a shell, a front for one man to walk around acting like a cop under the HOA's blessing. And somehow, Margaret Langley had either missed it or didn't care. That evening, I made another visit. Not to Margaret, but to my neighbors. At the weekly community circle, usually a casual get-together with wine, dogs, and kids on scooters, I stood on the grassy common and shared what had happened. He pulled you over, someone asked. Claimed I failed to signal, I said. But he was operating under false pretenses. An older man frowned. But wasn't he the one who gave out those flyers about car break-ins? The one who helped clean graffiti off the park benches? He also wrote a citation to a teenager for skateboarding and told a mother she couldn't park within 50 feet of the pool gate, I said, all without legal authority. That got their attention. Deborah, a longtime resident and former HOA secretary, crossed her arms. We were never told about any formal security contract. Margaret just said we were enhancing neighborhood presence. I met her gaze. Would you be willing to say that in a statement? She nodded, gladly. As the sky dimmed and porch lights flickered on, people started murmuring among themselves. Conversation shifted. Perspectives changed. The illusion of safety Robert Bennett had projected started unraveling. But I knew that illusion had been built carefully, brick by brick. It wasn't just Robert. It was a system of unchecked authority that had been growing under our noses. And I was going to tear it down by the book, in broad daylight, for everyone to see. I spent the weekend reviewing every document Margaret Langley begrudgingly turned over. There were the fake-looking invoices from Secure Path Solutions, which billed the HOA monthly at a suspiciously round figure, $3,000. No line items, no hours logged, just vague descriptors like community enforcement and on-call patrols. There was even a list of so-called violations Robert Bennett had supposedly addressed: littering, illegal bird feeders, grass longer than 3 inches. One entry caught my eye. May 12th, 9:45 p.m. Black Tahoe speeding through Birch Lane. No signal used. Warning issued. That was me. Not only had Robert documented the stop, he'd written it up like a legitimate law enforcement report. I couldn't help but laugh. The irony of it, the absurdity, the audacity. But there was nothing funny about what it implied. This wasn't a rogue HOA board member going overboard with a rent-a-cop. This was an organized abuse of power, propped up by fake authority and real money. And somewhere in the mess, my neighbors were being fleeced and intimidated into submission. Monday morning, I received a call from Officer Tran. Chief, he said you're going to want to see this. In the evidence locker sat a box we'd retrieved from Robert Bennett's apartment after his detainment, a legal search done with warrant and due process. Inside, more forged citations, several HOA-style ID badges with different names, and a folder labeled Compliance Training Module. I flipped it open. Inside was a poorly photocopied packet that started with HOA Enforcement Protocol for internal use only, authorized under the Private Community Enforcement Act, PCA. All violations subject to internal HOA legal structure. Residents may be cited, fined, or detained for non-compliance under Charter 7.2. There was no such thing as a Private Community Enforcement Act. He'd made it up. And the worst part, I suspected Margaret and the board knew it, or at least chose not to question it. Tran placed another sheet of paper in front of me. This one's got your name on it. It was a draft warrant fake, of course, but bearing the HOA's seal and Robert's forged signature. It claimed I was to be fined and barred from driving inside Willow Creek for repeated conduct violations. I clenched my jaw. This had escalated from impersonation to conspiracy and harassment, and that's when I made my next move. I called the district attorney. Laura Martinez had known me for years, long before I became chief, when I was still a detective working narcotics in West Riverside. She was sharp, fair, and not one for political games. I briefed her on everything: the fake citations, the bogus company, the potential complicity of the HOA board, and now the forged documents naming me. She listened quietly. When I finished, she exhaled slowly. This isn't just impersonation anymore, she said. This is fraud, intimidation, and abuse of office. If the HOA used Robert to target specific homeowners and used HOA funds to do it, we could be looking at embezzlement and civil rights violations. I need it stopped, I said simply, not just punished. I want this torn out by the roots. She nodded. Let's start with a grand jury inquiry. While Laura prepared the case, I took the community angle into my own hands. I wrote a formal letter, as police chief and as a resident, to every single homeowner in Willow Creek Estates. I laid out the facts, concise, clear, and without inflammatory language. I attached a list of your rights as a homeowner, explained the limitations of HOA authority under state law, and invited everyone to a town hall meeting. It was time people saw the truth for themselves. The night of the meeting, the community center was packed. I'd never seen so many people show up for a neighborhood event. Retirees with notebooks, young parents holding babies, even high school kids, curious or perhaps just along for the drama. I stood at the front and, for the first time, spoke not as chief, but as a neighbor. I've served as a police officer for over 30 years, I began. I've seen gangs, cartels, even political corruption. But I've rarely seen something as quietly dangerous as this. I projected Robert's fake citation on the screen. This, I said, is not law. It's fear dressed up like authority. Gasps, murmurs. Heads turned toward Margaret Langley, who sat stiffly near the back, arms folded like stone. I clicked to the next slide, Robert's LLC registration, with his name in bold. This is the man the HOA paid, using your dues, not through a vote, not through open process, but in secret. I clicked again, showing the bogus Private Enforcement Act. This is fiction. There is no such law. But it was used to intimidate you, to fine you, to make you believe you were powerless. I paused. Let me make this very clear. You are not powerless. I saw it land. In their eyes, in their posture. A single hand raised. It was Deborah again, the former secretary. What can we do now? And just like that, the tide turned. That week, 4 board members resigned. A petition was drafted, and in record time, a vote was held to restructure the HOA. Margaret resisted at first, claiming due process. But once the DA's office issued a subpoena for HOA financial records, she quietly stepped down. Robert Bennett was officially charged with impersonating a law enforcement officer, mail fraud, and falsifying documents. He pleaded not guilty, but the evidence was overwhelming. And I stood in my yard the following Sunday, watching my neighbors talk to each other with something new in their voices. Relief, confidence, a sense of control. It wasn't just about Robert. It was about the culture of compliance that had quietly taken root and how we'd finally ripped it out before it could grow deeper. I knew we still had more to do. The damage wasn't just legal. It was emotional. And as the neighborhood began to heal, I made a quiet vow to ensure no one ever again felt bullied or silenced behind a badge that wasn't earned. The incident with Robert Bennett left a fracture across the neighborhood. The mask had slipped, revealing a face of control beneath what had once seemed like ordinary community enforcement. But even after Robert's arrest and the resignations on the HOA board, a residue of unease remained. Not everyone was convinced this was the end of it, and they were right. The more I pulled at the threads, the more I saw how deep the rot had spread. So I took a trip to the county clerk's office, hoping to find clarity in the most boring place imaginable, paper records. I wasn't disappointed. There, nestled between floodplain surveys and easement filings, were dozens of amendments the HOA had filed over the years. Some were routine pool regulations, architectural standards, but others were quietly alarming. One document, filed just 8 months prior, granted temporary law enforcement privileges to contracted safety officers. Now, that wasn't legal. No homeowners association has the authority to grant law enforcement powers, not even temporary. That's a state matter, and these words had no standing. But what concerned me wasn't just the illegality. It was the intent. They knew what they were doing. They weren't confused. They were pretending to be confused, while building a private enforcement system around a fiction. Back at the station, I cross-referenced those filings with community reports over the past year. Complaints had increased about ticketing, intimidation, unauthorized inspections, but most had never made it to our department because they'd been redirected to the HOA. One report stood out. A woman named Lisa Carter had filed a complaint 6 weeks ago after her teenage son was detained by someone in a black uniform near the neighborhood basketball court. According to her, the man accused her son of vandalism, ordered him to sit on the curb, and photographed his ID without her consent. The complaint had been logged, then dismissed. I picked up the phone at Dusty and called Lisa. She answered on the first ring. Chief Harris. Yes, Lisa. I'm looking into the situation with Robert Bennett and the HOA enforcement program. I came across your report. I figured no one would ever read that thing again, she said bitterly. I almost pulled my son out of school. He was traumatized. That guy screamed at him in front of his friends like he was a criminal. Did you get a name? No badge. Just a patch and a vest. But it was the same guy you arrested, wasn't it? Yes, I said. I'm sorry it wasn't handled sooner. I'm reviewing every incident now. There was a pause. I just don't understand how this happened, she's whispered. This is supposed to be a safe place. That was what hurt the most. They had used safety as a disguise for dominance. I promised her I'd make it right. The next day, I walked into Margaret Langley's office one last time. She'd refused to speak publicly since stepping down, but I wasn't there for politics. I wanted answers. Margaret, I said calmly, I'd like to know who gave Robert Bennett the language for those documents. The Private Enforcement Act, the citation codes, all of it. She looked pale. The kind of pale that comes from sleepless nights and unavoidable truths. It wasn't me, she said. It was our compliance consultant. Name. She hesitated. Michael J. Pierce. He said he was a retired attorney specializing in community law. I found him through a referral board for HOA presidents. I wrote it down. Do you have an address? Just an email. He insisted on remote meetings. I looked her in the eye. Did you ever check his credentials? She shook her head. He sounded convincing. He had examples. He even gave us templates. I sighed. This wasn't just a HOA gone rogue. It was a cottage industry of pseudo-legal bullies, arming neighborhoods with bad doctrine and fake authority. Back at the station, my tech unit traced Michael Pierce's email through a proxy chain. Eventually, we found the originating IP, a private server based in Nevada, tied to a known scam operation involving fraudulent legal documents. We sent the file to the FBI. In the meantime, I needed to face the HOA residents again. Not in a town hall. This time, in the streets. I began walking the neighborhood in uniform, knocking on doors, introducing myself not as the chief, but as James, a neighbor, a father, someone who cared. I listened. Stories poured out. An elderly couple who had been fined repeatedly for potted plant violations. A single mother who had been threatened with a lien for putting up Halloween decorations early. A disabled veteran who was told he couldn't park in his own driveway because his truck looked too commercial. Each citation had come from Robert or someone under his influence. Each one was based on nonsense. And worst of all, the victims had believed they had no choice but to comply. That week, I drafted a new policy in collaboration with the City Council. No entity, private or public, may conduct enforcement actions, traffic stops, or detentions within city limits, unless properly commissioned and recognized by the Riverside Police Department. The council passed it unanimously. I posted the signed ordinance on every HOA bulletin board in Willow Creek. No more fake cops. No more badges without training. No more silence. As I left one of the community parks, I saw a group of kids on scooters pass by. One of them waved, "Hey, you're the guy who caught the fake cop, right?" I smiled. I'm the guy who made sure it won't happen again. It was supposed to be over. The fake officer was behind bars. The HOA board had been shaken. The community was alert and beginning to recover. But power, even when cornered, doesn't surrender quietly. It was a Wednesday morning when I saw it. Taped to my mailbox was a bright yellow envelope, stamped urgent, compliance action. At first glance, it looked like just another leftover document from the Robert Bennett era. But inside was something different and far more insidious. A letter, written in an aggressive legalistic tone, accused me of violating HOA security disruption protocols by interfering with contracted agents performing delegated enforcement duties. It cited a so-called clause in the HOA charter that no longer even existed, one that had been struck from the bylaws during the last revision. It ended with this line: failure to cease retaliatory behavior may result in civil and criminal escalation, including citizen's arrest under community code provisions. I stood in my driveway, reading that sentence over and over. They were threatening to arrest me, again. But this time, they weren't using a fake cop in a beat-up Tahoe. They were using the remnants of a system I'd just dismantled, weaponizing leftover rules and half-truths to intimidate me, as if their silence had been temporary, as if they were regrouping. That night, I attended the first HOA meeting since the scandal broke. Margaret Langley, though technically resigned, still hovered at the edges, showing up as a consultant for the interim board. She didn't speak when I entered, but the tension in the room shifted. People stared at me, uncertain whether to make space or take sides. I waited my turn. When the floor opened for public comment, I stepped up, holding the yellow envelope. "I received this today," I said evenly. "It claims I violated a code that no longer exists, threatens arrest under a statute that holds no legal weight, and cites authority your board no longer has." No one responded. I continued. "I'm here as a resident, not as chief of police, and as a resident, I demand to know who sent this." Margaret finally spoke. "That document was issued by a member of our compliance committee." "Which member?" She folded her hands. "The committee prefers anonymity for safety reasons." I nearly laughed. "Anonymity to send legal threats to neighbors." A man in the back stood up. "William Carter, former treasurer." "That letter wasn't authorized by the board," he said. "We didn't vote on any disciplinary action against you. If Margaret sent it on behalf of anyone, she did it alone." Gasps swept the room. Margaret turned pale. I was simply advising." "No," I cut in. "You were issuing legal threats under the false pretense of authority." Again. I walked up to the front table and dropped the envelope. "I'm filing a police report tonight, and if this happens to any other resident, not just me, I'll make sure we add criminal harassment to the list of charges." I walked out. Later that evening, I sat in my kitchen again. Same table, different posture. This time, I wasn't just reacting. I was planning. I pulled out my laptop and opened a folder titled Willow Creek Civil Archive. Over the past month, I had quietly compiled records, complaints, and testimonies from dozens of residents, not just about Robert Bennett, but about the pattern that allowed someone like him to thrive. Dozens of HOA fines that exceeded legal maximums, unauthorized inspections by board members, selective enforcement against people who spoke out. And Margaret, she was at the center of most of it. I drafted an affidavit and submitted it to the district attorney. This time, the charge was more expansive, organized harassment under color of community authority. I also worked with City Council to introduce a Neighborhood Oversight Act, requiring all HOAs in the county to submit their enforcement protocols for legal review. And any community wishing to hire security would need to do so through licensed bonded agencies, approved by law enforcement. No more backdoor deals, no more made-up rules. The following week, Margaret Langley was served with a cease and desist order. It was poetic, in a way. She had spent years hiding behind official-looking documents, manipulating language to control her neighbors. Now, it was real legal paper signed by a judge that finally stripped her of that power. But before she was gone for good, she tried one last tactic: a video. It showed up in the HOA newsletter, which she still had partial access to. In it, she sat behind a desk, framed by flags and awards. She spoke to the camera in a calm, steady tone. "Friends and neighbors," she began, "I know recent events have been troubling, and I regret that confusion has replaced the harmony we once enjoyed. But I must warn you, when police power replaces community voice, we all lose." I watched the video twice. Then I called the newsletter publisher and ordered an immediate takedown. That night, I wrote my own letter. I didn't send it through the newsletter. I posted it on every community board, every social media page, every street corner where people walk their dogs. To my neighbors, my name is James Harris. You know me as your police chief. But first, I'm your neighbor. I've lived here for over a decade. I've watched our kids grow up together. I've trimmed the same hedges and chased the same trash cans during storms. What happened here was not just a misunderstanding. It was a breach of trust. We entrusted a few with power, and they used it to control, not protect. But we stood up, and we changed it. This neighborhood is yours. It's not a precinct. It's not a dictatorship. It's home. If you ever feel afraid again, don't knock on a stranger's door in uniform. Knock on mine. I'll be there. When I walked the neighborhood the next morning, I noticed something remarkable. People were smiling. They waved. They made eye contact. Kids biked freely again. The air felt lighter. Not because everything was perfect, but because the fear was gone. And for the first time, In a long time, Willow Creek felt like a community. It happened again. Another self-appointed enforcer, this time in a tan tactical vest and a walkie-talkie clipped to his shoulder, like some parody of law enforcement, stopped one of my neighbors, Daniel Alvarez, at the entrance of our cul-de-sac. The reason: suspicious behavior and failure to maintain visible HOA sticker. I got the call from Daniel's wife while I was trimming hedges. He's being harassed by another one of those fake cops, she whispered, panic creeping into her voice. He's not even letting Daniel leave the car. I dropped the clippers and got into my cruiser. Uniform on, no lights, no sirens. Just a slow, deliberate drive up the block. By the time I pulled up, the officer was standing beside Daniel's car, tapping on the window with the butt of a flashlight. Daniel, looking more confused than afraid, was holding his phone up, recording. I stepped out of the cruiser and approached the scene. "Problem here?" I asked, voice low, calm. The man turned. He was younger than Robert Bennett had been, maybe mid-30s, but with the same swagger, the same smug belief that a vest and authority-sounding phrases gave him power. He glanced at my badge, then at my face. "This is an HOA enforcement matter, sir," he said, hand resting on his utility belt, where a can of pepper spray sat beside a plastic holster. I tilted my head. "You work for the HOA," he nodded. "Community Patrol Division. Authorized for on-site deterrence and compliance verification." "Got ID?" I asked. He pulled out a laminated card that looked like it had been made on a home printer. No state seal, no license number, just a logo that read Willow Creek Protective Services, and his name, Kevin Reynolds. "You know impersonating a police officer is a Class A misdemeanor in this state?" I asked. "I'm not impersonating. I'm community security, HOA backed." I pulled out my own badge. His eyes locked onto it. "Chief of Police, Riverside County." His smirk vanished. "I need you to step back from the vehicle," I said firmly. "Hands visible. Keep your voice down." Daniel rolled down the window. He said he was going to cite me for obstruction if I didn't show HOA ID. "You're fine, Daniel. Head home. I'll follow up later." Kevin shifted uneasily, inching back toward his car, a black SUV with a flashing amber light on top, and security enforcement painted in aggressive stencil font across the side. I moved with him. "I'm going to need your keys," I said, extending my hand. "You can't." "I can," I interrupted. "I'm detaining you under suspicion of impersonating a law enforcement officer and unlawfully detaining a resident." His eyes darted around the cul-de-sac. Curtains were pulling back. A jogger stopped mid-stride to watch. A neighbor came out holding her dog, phone already aimed. "This is harassment," Kevin barked. "You don't know who you're messing with." "I do," I said calmly. "I know exactly who you are. And who sent you." I cuffed him. No drama, no struggle, just 2 clicks and a stunned silence. I called it in to dispatch and requested transport. By the time the market unit arrived, 3 more neighbors had come out. A few clapped softly. One man just nodded in silent thanks. I gave my report, then turned to Kevin one last time before they put him in the car. "Tell Margaret I said I'm done playing chess. This isn't a game." Back at the precinct, I sat with Tran and reviewed Kevin's background. No criminal record, but no licensing credentials either. The security company he claimed to work for, Willow Creek Protective Services, wasn't registered anywhere in the state. A shell. But the payments were real. We traced transfers from the HOA account, totaling over $25,000 in the last 6 months, to an account tied to a dummy LLC, which in turn linked back to Margaret Langley. She was laundering enforcement authority through ghost companies. It was an empire of shadows, carefully constructed and hidden beneath HOA meeting minutes, vague budget line items, and convoluted language like external compliance services. I brought it all to Laura Martinez, the DA. She stared at the board we'd assembled. Red lines connecting accounts, contracts, names. "This is racketeering," she said, "on a community scale. But it's organized, intentional. We've got conspiracy, misappropriation of funds, unauthorized law enforcement activity." "Can we go federal?" I asked. "If we tie any of it to interstate communication," yes, she replied. "And with those shell companies, I think we can." Within a week, subpoenas were issued. The HOA's bank froze discretionary accounts. City auditors began poring over years of financial records, and Margaret, she vanished. Just gone. Phone disconnected. Mail piling up. Her house quiet. Some said she'd gone to visit her sister in Idaho. Others claimed she was hiding out at a lake cabin 2 counties over. I didn't care. She'd have to face the system eventually. What mattered now was the neighborhood. I stood again before the town hall, not as chief, but as witness. I showed them Kevin's fake badge, explained the payments, shared the truth in careful, steady tones. There was no anger in the room this time, only clarity. We knew what we had allowed to take root. We knew who had watered it, and now we knew how to dig it up. The residents voted unanimously to dissolve the HOA's enforcement wing permanently and demanded full transparency for all future budgets. A temporary committee was formed to revise the charter, with legal counsel present at every step. For the first time in years, power belonged to the people again. And as I left the community center that night, a man in his 80s, a veteran like me, shook my hand. "You didn't just cuff a crook's son," he said. "You uncuffed the whole neighborhood." I nodded, but I also knew this wasn't the end. You never forget the feeling of calling in your own officers to deal with something so absurd, it borders on the surreal. I had cuffed the second fake HOA cop, Kevin Reynolds, in the middle of our cul-de-sac, with neighbors peering through their blinds. And now I stood waiting for the official squad car to arrive. My hands were steady, my expression neutral, but inside, something simmered in anger I hadn't felt since my early years on the force. When the patrol unit rolled up, lights flashing, no sirens as Officer Sanders and Ortiz stepped out, their eyes flicking from me to Kevin. "You okay?" Chief Sanders asked, brows furrowed. "I'm good." "This one was impersonating again," I said, gesturing at Kevin, who now looked pale and sweaty. "Claims to be community security. No license, no credentials, no authority." Same type of setup Robert Bennett had. It's the same operation, just more brazen. Sanders nodded and took Kevin by the arm. "You have the right to remain silent," he began. And the familiar cadence of Miranda filled the suburban air, like a cleansing wind. Kevin started to protest. "This is a misunderstanding. I was told I could." But Ortiz gently, yet firmly, guided him into the back of the patrol car. Slam, locked. I turned to Sanders. "Get his car impounded. Have CSU photograph everything inside. I want chain of custody documented. He may be just the pawn, but his phone, that's the bishop, rook, and queen all in one." Sanders gave a tight nod. "Understood." As they began collecting evidence from Kevin's vehicle, I scanned the growing group of neighbors. Word had spread fast. Some people held phones aloft, recording silently. Others murmured, not with panic this time, but disbelief. A new kind of awareness was sinking in. The wool was falling from everyone's eyes. I saw Lisa Carter, whose son had been harassed weeks ago, standing next to Daniel Alvarez. They both met my gaze and gave a solemn nod. No more pretending, no more deference to fake authority. By the next morning, the footage had gone viral thanks to a neighbor's TikTok video capturing the exact moment I revealed my badge and cuffed Kevin. And the caption, "HOA cop tries to detain chief of police." Guess how that ended? Over 2 million views in 24 hours. The mayor called. "So James," she said between laughs, "you planning to start a reality show?" "I'd rather just have a functioning HOA," I said dryly. She chuckled. Then her tone turned serious. "You've got a green light for anything you need. I'll support a full audit, and I've already spoken with the county attorney. This can't be allowed to continue." "Thank you," I said. "I'm not stopping until it's all out in the open." That same afternoon, I received a call from Agent Dubois with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. "We've reviewed the documents your office sent. There's enough here to open a formal inquiry. Financial fraud, unauthorized enforcement, possible civil rights violations. We believe the ringleader Margaret Langley is in the wind," I informed him. "We'll find her," he replied. While the federal wheels began to turn, I focused on Willow Creek. My first step was meeting with the remaining HOA board members. Most of them had either resigned or distanced themselves from the mess, but a few lingered, unsure of their footing. We met in the old clubhouse, stripped of its smug veneer, now that the enforcement division had been dismantled. The mood was somber, defensive. I didn't speak as chief, I spoke as a neighbor. "You owe this community more than silence," I told them. "You owe them truth, transparency, and a plan to make this right." "We didn't know what Margaret was doing," one of them muttered. "You didn't ask," I replied evenly. "You saw uniforms and badges, and assumed it was legitimate. But deep down, you knew something was off, and you looked away." There was a long silence. Finally, Elizabeth Monroe, one of the longest-standing board members, spoke. "I want to help fix it," she said. "I know that doesn't absolve me, but I want to start." That was enough for now. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of restructuring. The community elected a temporary oversight committee made up of residents unaffiliated with the prior board. I recommended Lisa Carter for the role of ethics chair, and she accepted with grace and resolve. We held a town hall not in the HOA building, but in the school gymnasium, where everyone could speak freely. People voiced their fears, their anger, but also their ideas for healing. "We don't just want to punish," one resident said. "We want to rebuild." I watched quietly as the neighborhood took its first real step toward becoming a community again. But there was one last confrontation I wasn't expecting. It happened outside my own house. I had just come back from the station, tired, thinking about dinner, when a silver Lexus pulled up behind me. Margaret. She stepped out, sunglasses masking her eyes, but her mouth tight with defensiveness. "James," she said curtly. "Margaret," I replied, folding my arms. "I want to set the record straight." "Too late," I said. "You had years." "I was trying to keep order," she snapped. "This neighborhood was slipping, trash cans left out, noise violations, people letting standards fall. I was protecting this place. By hiring fake cops and laundering money through shell companies, I was correcting behavior. And now the law is correcting yours." She turned to leave, but I stopped her. "For what it's worth, Margaret," I said, "you could have made a real difference. You had power, influence. But you chose control over community, fear over fairness. That's on you." She didn't respond, just drove off. But I could tell something in her had cracked. She wasn't untouchable anymore. The badge I wore had reminded her of that, and this time, she was the one being watched. By now, the facade had completely crumbled. The security patrols were gone, their vehicles towed, their so-called credentials confiscated. Kevin Reynolds remained in custody, his charges growing as investigators dug into his prior record, including previous impersonation charges in another state. The homeowners were waking up, and yet, the deeper we looked, the darker the truth beneath Willow Creek's surface became. I spent my mornings in uniform at the precinct and my evenings in my home office, poring through the years of HOA records, bank statements, and emails that had been turned over during the investigation. I wasn't acting as chief anymore. I was a neighbor, a victim, and unofficially, a lead investigator on a case that had crossed far beyond the lines of community mismanagement. It started small line items in budgets labeled security enhancements and emergency response training, harmless sounding at first glance. But those line items didn't match any contractor invoices filed with the city. When I followed the trail, I found payments wired to LLCs that only existed on paper, no business licenses, no employees, no trace beyond P.O. boxes and generic Gmail addresses. Over $210,000 spent in 18 months. The money had come from inflated HOA dues, fines that had been doubled or tripled against certain residents, and even late fees that were applied within 24 hours of a missed payment, a clear violation of state law. It was a racketeering operation, wearing the costume of neighborhood order, and the architect of it all, Margaret Langley. Though she'd vanished after our last confrontation, the documentation painted a vivid picture. She hadn't just manipulated the board, she'd controlled it. Bylaws had been rewritten with vague language granting her broad powers in times of security concern. Votes had been held without quorum. Amendments passed by email chains, rather than open meetings. And Robert Bennett, the first fake cop, had been paid not just in checks, but in cash withdrawals Margaret made personally. One of the most damning discoveries came from an HOA board meeting recording that someone anonymously left in my mailbox. The audio was scratchy, but unmistakable. Margaret's voice: "If people feel watched, they behave. Fear is order. That's how you keep property values high." It wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. I turned the files over to the DA's office, who confirmed the evidence supported charges of fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. The FBI had already issued a federal warrant for Margaret's arrest. Now, it was only a matter of time. At the next HOA emergency meeting now held at the school gymnasium, I stood before the community with a projector, a microphone, and no uniform, just truth. I clicked through slide after slide, payments to shell companies, altered bylaws and backdated signatures, screenshots of fines sent through Venmo to personal accounts. The room grew quieter with each revelation. Gasps, murmurs, then silence. I know this is hard to take in, I said. I know many of you trusted her, trusted the board. You believe the rules were protecting you. I paused. They weren't. A hand went up. Mrs. Ellis, who lived 3 houses down from me. How do we fix this? I looked around the room, at faces I'd passed for years, at porches I'd nodded toward without ever really knowing who lived behind them. We do what communities should have done from the start, I said. We listen, we include, we protect, not punish. We make sure power is earned, not inherited. And we make it transparent. A voice called out Chief Harris for HOA president. Laughter erupted, the good kind. The kind that heals, the kind that says, we've made it through the fire, and we're still standing. I smiled, holding up my hands. Let's just fix the house before we decorate it. But not everyone was ready to move on. A few of Margaret's loyalists tried to cast doubt, called the investigation a witch hunt, claimed I had a personal vendetta, that I had embarrassed the community on social media, that I had weaponized my badge. But the tide had turned. For every one of them, 10 others stood up with their own stories. A family fined for installing a wheelchair ramp. A single mom harassed for leaving toys in her yard. A veteran told his flagpole was unsightly, and they weren't scared anymore. The board voted to dissolve entirely and start over from scratch with a legally supervised election, open nominations, and third-party oversight. I declined any official role, but agreed to serve on the ethics advisory panel. Change had begun. Then the phone call came. It was Agent Dubois. We got her, he said. Arrested crossing into Utah. Fake ID, burner phone, cash. Relief hit me like a quiet wave. Not with celebration, but with closure. What's next, I asked. Extradition. Charges will include wire fraud, impersonation, and civil rights violations. It'll be a process. But that was okay, because for the first time, the process was working for us. I walked around the lake that evening, past the old clubhouse, past the newly posted notice announcing the temporary dissolution of HOA activities. A group of kids were playing with a frisbee. Their laughter echoed across the water. I stopped near the pier, the same spot I used to avoid, because of the security zone signs Margaret had put up. Now, those signs were gone. Just the lake, just the sky, just the community, finally free from fear. And I stood there, breathing it in the sound of a neighborhood healing. The days that followed Kevin Reynolds' arrest and the exposure of Willow Creek's fake security force felt like a slow unraveling of everything people thought they understood about our neighborhood. What once seemed like strict but tolerable rules now appeared as acts of quiet oppression. The illusion of order had shattered, and in its place stood a community grappling with betrayal. The video footage of my encounter with Kevin, especially the moment I flashed my badge, and his expression dropped, went viral. It was shared not only in our HOA's private group chats, but on local news stations, neighborhood forums, even national sites that loved a good story about small-town corruption. Police chief outsmarts fake HOA cop. The headlines practically wrote themselves. But behind the clicks and shares, something deeper was happening. The residents of Willow Creek weren't just entertained, they were angry. I watched it unfold from my porch. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before were now stopping by just to vent, to ask questions, or to apologize for not believing earlier complaints, for assuming the HOA's power was legitimate, for complying when their gut told them something felt wrong. My son got fined for leaving his skateboard on the porch, one father told me. They said it violated community decorum. I paid it. I thought that was normal. It wasn't, I said quietly. The stories came in waves. A widow charged $150 for unauthorized wind chimes. A veteran told to remove his flagpole. A single mother forced to pay for a second mailbox because hers was too ornate. What had seemed like isolated annoyances were now revealed as part of a coordinated racket, one that had operated in plain sight. And now, with Margaret Langley still out of view, and the board scrambling for cover, the people of Willow Creek were demanding answers. An emergency HOA meeting was scheduled. For the first time in years, every seat in the community hall was filled, standing room only. I didn't attend as a police officer. I came as a homeowner. Margaret arrived 10 minutes late, dressed immaculately, carrying a binder of prepared remarks. Her calm demeanor was jarring, almost surreal given what had happened. She stood at the podium, and addressed the crowd like a teacher trying to soothe an unruly classroom. These past few days have been challenging, she began. There has been misinformation, misunderstandings. The intention behind our security enhancements was never to instill fear, but to ensure safety. Murmurs spread across the room, like a ripple in still water. A man in the back, Mr. Walton, a longtime resident, stood up and raised his voice. Is it a misunderstanding that you paid someone with a criminal record to impersonate law enforcement? Margaret's expression froze. Another hand, Mrs. Alvarez, whose mother had been fined for hanging laundry. Why were HOA fines sent to personal Venmo accounts? Margaret shuffled her papers, clearly thrown. Those were administrative oversights. I was unaware of some of the details. Our treasurer, I stood up. Your signature is on every disbursement form, Margaret. Every payment to fake companies, every fine rerouted to unregistered accounts. She looked at me, and for the first time, her polished mask cracked. You're not here as an officer, she said. No, I replied. I'm here as a resident, and as someone who believes our community deserves the truth. The dam broke, one by one. People rose to speak, not just to accuse Margaret, but to tell their stories. Quiet stories of humiliation, of fear, of helplessness. One woman broke down as she described being threatened with foreclosure over a missed $45 payment. A disabled man showed his stack of violation notices for having his wheelchair ramp out of compliance. A teenage girl spoke about how her family was harassed for planting sunflowers. The shame in that room didn't belong to the residents anymore. It clung to Margaret and the board. Someone stood up and yelled, "We need to dissolve this whole board." Applause followed, real, spontaneous, unified. That night, a petition was circulated calling for the full resignation of the HOA leadership. Within 24 hours, over 70% of the households had signed it. Of course, there was resistance. A few of Margaret's loyalists, mostly people who had benefited from her favor, accused me of leading a witch hunt. They said I was using my badge to push a political agenda, that I was embarrassing Willow Creek in the media. But their voices were drowned out, because for every accusation, there were 10 people sharing receipts, letters, fines, photos of things confiscated or destroyed. No one wanted to go back to the way things were. The movement grew. Residents organized informal committees. A Facebook group called Willow Creek Reform ballooned to over 300 members within days. Lawyers were consulted. City officials were looped in. A draft for a new resident-driven charter was proposed, one that demanded transparency, term limits, and third-party audits. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid. They were empowered. Late one evening, I received a call from Mrs. Ellis, the elderly woman who once warned me about HOA patrols. She asked if she could bring something over. When she arrived, she handed me a folded piece of paper. It was a handwritten letter. I just wanted you to know. She said I voted for Margaret to be president. I thought she was protecting us. I didn't see what was happening. You weren't the only one, I said softly. She made us think fear was safety, she whispered. But it was never safety. It was silence. I nodded. I hope you'll run for president now, she said, her voice trembling. We need someone who sees us. I didn't have an answer. I didn't want power. I just wanted healing. But it meant something that she asked. 2 days later, someone placed a sign at the lake's edge, where the old HOA patrol zone markers had stood. It was hand-painted, simple, and beautiful. Willow Creek belongs to the people, not the power. The sign wasn't official, but it was more powerful than any policy we'd ever had, because it came from us. The lake shimmered in the golden wash of morning light. It had always been beautiful, calm, reflective, unbothered by the chaos we humans churned up along its shores. But today, it looked different. It looked like it belonged to all of us again. 2 weeks had passed since the emergency meeting. 2 weeks since the community, once subdued by fear and fines, found its voice. And in those 2 weeks, the people of Willow Creek had done what bureaucracies usually took months or years to accomplish. We cleaned house. The entire HOA board, Margaret included, was formally dissolved under the Articles of Incorporation. The city clerk's office, now involved thanks to multiple resident filings, confirmed the HOA had violated several ordinances and fiduciary responsibilities. That, coupled with the evidence I'd turned over, was enough to invalidate the current leadership's legitimacy. They were done. Margaret Langley didn't show up for her final hearing. She was found several counties over, living under a false name. In a short-term rental booked with prepaid cards, the FBI picked her up and extradited her back to our jurisdiction. She would face trial for embezzlement, fraud, impersonation by proxy, and a slew of civil rights violations. It was a strange kind of relief, not loud or vindictive, just quiet, clean, necessary. But now came the harder part, rebuilding something better. The residents voted to appoint a temporary ethics committee while drafting a new charter. They asked me to serve as chair. I declined the title, but agreed to help coordinate. I still didn't want power, but I wanted to help people protect themselves from it. We held meetings at the school auditorium every Tuesday night. Anyone could attend. No one was turned away. Even the most disgruntled residents, the ones who'd previously weaponized HOA rules for personal vendettas, showed up and sat in the same rows as the people they once fined for leaving trash cans out too long. It wasn't always easy. There were arguments, tensions, old wounds reopened. But something remarkable happened. People stayed. They listened. They tried. A single mother who once feared eviction was elected to oversee finance. A retiree who'd never spoken at meetings before volunteered to run neighborhood mediation. We even got a city liaison assigned to us to ensure that whatever we built now would be rooted in law, not interpretation. And all the while, the energy in Willow Creek shifted. The no loitering signs came down. Kids played in cul-de-sacs again. Flags flew without incident. Garden beds bloomed with wildflowers, no longer deemed non-compliant. And the lake, once cordoned off by fake security zones, now hosted family picnics, couples walking hand in hand, and the occasional paddleboarder at dusk. It felt like a place where people lived, not just existed under regulation. One night, I walked the loop around the lake alone. No patrol cars, no HOA vehicles with flashing lights, just the sound of frogs croaking and the faint whisper of sprinklers in the distance. I stopped near the water's edge, right where it had all started, where Kevin had pulled me over with a fake badge and too much bravado. That moment had turned everything upside down, but it had also revealed the rot we'd been living with, and it gave us a chance to start over. A voice startled me from behind. "Chief!" I turned to see Nathan, a teenager from a few blocks down, the same kid who'd once been fined for riding his bike too fast on a residential street. "Hey," I said, "you out late?" "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Too quiet now." I smiled. "That's a good problem to have." He nodded, kicking a small rock into the water. "People say you saved the neighborhood." I shook my head. "No, the neighborhood saved itself. I just turned on a light." On the first officials' day of our new charter, we gathered at the community center. No suits, no podiums, just folding chairs and shared snacks. Someone brought lemonade. Someone else brought homemade cookies. I stood in the back and watched as neighbors greeted one another like old friends, even if they'd never spoken before. Barriers had fallen. Hierarchies had collapsed. All that remained was shared space and shared responsibility. A microphone was passed around. People spoke not in anger or accusation, but in hope. "I thought I didn't matter here," one woman said. "Now I feel seen." "I used to think rules made us better," a man added. "Now I know it's compassion that does." When the mic came to me, I hesitated, but I stood. "I was trained to enforce the law," I said. "But I've learned that enforcing trust is harder and more important. This isn't just about property values or clean sidewalks. It's about knowing your neighbor will stand up for you, not report you. That when someone knocks on your door, it's to ask if you're okay, not to issue a citation." I paused. "Let's build that kind of community. Let's make this place worth belonging to, not because of rules, but because of the people." Applause broke out, not the kind that fills auditoriums, but the kind that warms the chest. Later that evening, I walked home past the new sign at the lake's edge. The hand-painted one had been replaced with a more permanent marker, but the words stayed the same. Willow Creek belongs to the people, not the power. And this time, it wasn't just a slogan. It was a promise to ourselves, to each other, to anyone who ever needed a reminder that justice doesn't trickle down, it rises up. When enough people say, "No more." And this time, we had. The HOA didn't win. Fear didn't win. We did. And that's how I remember it. Not with sirens, not with handcuffs, but with a quiet walk by the water and the sound of laughter in the distance. Finally, unafraid.